Now we're going to spend some time going over the actual data archiving life cycle phases. The guide identifies several phases of the data archiving life cycle, and they're listed here. Ideally, NIJ grantees should plan for the archiving and dissemination of project data before the data even come into existence. We're going to go over each of these phases and identify key considerations to archiving at each step in the data creation process. Phase 1 is the proposal development and data archiving plan phase. Planning ahead during this early phase of the project development allows you to take into consideration important issues, particularly those related to confidentiality and disclosure risk from the very beginning. And this can really simplify the process, avert problems later on in the data deposit stage, and significantly reduce the cost of your project. This has already been discussed, but data archiving plans are critical for the development of the project, and they can be developed in conjunction with NACJD to maximize the utility of the data and ensure the availability of it in the long run. We really recommend that NIJ grantees consult with us as early as possible in the process to think through what to include and just have discussions with us about it as it relates to the ultimate submission of the data here with us. The archiving plan covers, we've already covered that in detail, but I just wanted to mention a few additional elements worth including or considering. Metadata. Metadata is data about the data, and so providing a detailed description of your data and discussing the standards used, developing lists of the actual variables needed for the project and how everything ties in together is absolutely essential to facilitating secondary data analysis. And as Patrick already mentioned, the archiving plan is really a living document that can be updated as needed throughout the preparation process, and the plan should reflect the ever-changing needs of the project. Project startup is the second phase. So once funding is received and the research project has begun, you will want to continue to think about and plan for the final form of the collection, which will ultimately be deposited with NACJD. Planning for the management and archiving of the data collection at the outset is critical to the project's success, and as I said a moment ago, can really significantly reduce the cost associated with the project if careful planning is done at this stage. On the screen are some initial items that we really encourage you to consider at the start of the project. For example, data file and structure. What will the data file look like and how will it be organized? What is the unit of analysis? Will there be one large data set or several shorter, smaller data files? Naming conventions. How will files and variables be named and what conventions will be used to achieve consistency? Data integrity. How will data be input or captured? Will the variable formats be numeric or character variables? What checks will be used to find invalid values, inconsistent responses, incomplete records, and things of that sort? Preparing data documentation. What will the documentation or metadata look like and how will it be produced? How much is necessary for future retrieval and archival processing? And what documentation standards will be used? Variable construction. What variables will be created after the collection of the original data and how will they be documented? Project documentation. What steps will be taken to document decisions that are made as the project unfolds? How will information be recorded on field procedures, coding decisions, variable construction, and other important decisions and elements like these? And finally, data verification. Now there are several computer-assisted interviewing assistance programs available, CADI and CAPI, to assist with data entry, integrity checking, checking skip patterns, and consistency. So using this type of software or similar software would be advised, as it assists with verifying that the data are entered correctly. The third phase of the data archiving lifecycle includes data collection and file creation. We're going to spend some time going over the benefits of quality data sets and the elements of quality data sets and documentation, with particular emphasis on items that NACJD or NACJD looks for when materials are deposited in fulfillment of the NIJ archiving requirements. Quality data sets are not just for other data users. There are benefits for the original data collector in that they preserve the original data and project information. They enable continued use of the data at a later date for future research projects, and they reduce the questions that secondary data analysts may ask when they make use of the data. It's worth mentioning here that NACJD has a toll-free number that is monitored Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, with the goal of providing assistance to secondary data users. So if the data are high quality, it promotes the ease of working with the data files. And then there's benefits for secondary data users as well. They allow for secondary data users to conduct analysis of existing data without the expense of additional data collection, and they provide resources to train new researchers. From a data user's perspective, a good data set is one that is easy to use. And so the process of producing a quality data set is easier if it's begun at the start of the research project. Some items to consider at this stage in the project include the choice of software package. So what statistical package is best to store and analyze the data, and which word processing package will work to organize the various types of documentation that was generated during the project. You will need to decide on the data file structure and content. Typically, a rectangular structure with columns as variables and rows as cases offers the most flexibility. Regarding the content, will multiple waves of data be stored in one file or in separate files? Will the analyses be performed at the case level, or, for example, will offender and victim records be analyzed separately? Use the software to transform, recode, or create variables. For example, setting variable formats and decimal specifications, flipping negatively loaded variables to be consistent with other variables when constructing scales, combining variables or collapsing them into new variables, or even creating weight variables. The coding should be saved to the documentation detailing how the transformations took place. Also, you'll want to use the documentation to record the decisions about the data right away. When a decision is made about the data, think about what needs to be documented about that aspect of the data and get it written down. Including dates and initials of the person that made the decision and recorded the information can be helpful as well. Producing quality documentation is then an ongoing process instead of something that is done retrospectively at the conclusion of the project. Also, as it relates to confidentiality issues, you'll want to determine how they will be handled and what de-identification techniques will be applied to the data. And then lastly, be sure that there's congruence between the data and the data collection instrument or other project materials. For example, use a variable naming convention for the data that ties to the corresponding sections and/or questions located in the survey instrument. And this could save a lot of time at that point rather than having to go back and trying to do it manually. On this slide, there are some elements of quality quantitative data. So on the left side of the screen, we have a column for codes and coding. So first, assigning a unique identifier to every record is recommended. This is typically the first variable in the data file and allows for easy identification of the record source document for verification purposes. Also, and very importantly, use mutually exclusive, exhaustive, and precisely defined codes. So this means every entry should fit into one and only one category. Ambiguity will cause not only coding difficulties, but also potentially problems with interpreting the data. Also, use standard codes to distinguish between different types of missing data. For example, if you use -8 to designate non-applicable cases and -9 for cases where data were not obtained and weren't expected. Also, including all cases and all variables, not just the variables of primary interest. Subsetting can be done later and as needed during analysis. The idea here is that other variables can be added later, and if that is the mentality, it can actually result in more time spent and variables end up out of order and just kind of jumbled up or possibly not entered at all, which can hinder data verification and cross-checking. So it's important to consider this at this stage in the process. Also, I wanted to note here that when you are at the point of being ready to archive your project deliverables with NACJD, you should be sure to submit de-identified data. Also, as it relates to data entry, be sure to use a data entry program that can catch typing errors and impossible values, and also, in some instances, enter default values. Several software programs offer these features, including the computer-assisted telephone and personal interviewing programs, as well as SPSS. Consider doing double entry, in which each record is entered twice from the original source. The second entry can be done by a different person, and then rekeying doesn't usually require a significant amount of time, and the computer can more quickly and accurately detect discrepancies than a visual check done by a person. Consider checking carefully the first 5 to 10% of the data records, and then randomly going through the file looking through the records, looking for consistency. Also, you'll want to preserve the original information and the coding scheme used in the data collection instrument as much as possible. And finally, as it relates to verification, you'll want to develop a good system for versioning. And this is particularly important as the analysis file develops if multiple people are working on the project. It provides a way to check for duplicate values, unlabeled codes, and inconsistencies. Quality geospatial data. The preferred format that we receive data files in is a standard package such as ESRI shapefiles. In conjunction with files, you want to, these are used in conjunction with files that can produce visualizations or maps. You should include geographic data not used in any visualization, such as sanitized address information at the block level, county name, census tract number. And again, when you are ready to archive your data, you'll just want to make sure that it's aggregated to a level so that it is de-identified. And then qualitative data. So the preferred formats include text in plain files, rich text, Microsoft Word, or other machine-readable files such as PDF with optical character resolution. If the data are in database format, Microsoft Access is preferred. And if it is in spreadsheet format, Microsoft Excel is the preferred format. Data in these formats, of course, need to be completely de-identified before archiving unless informed consent was secured from participant sources. Any data that is transcribed should include a unique identifier, a uniform layout, as well as documentation header with brief details of the interview, page numbers, that type of information to help secondary data analysts, and NACJD processors that are going through the files. And then also speaker tags indicating the question-answer sequence. Study documentation. So now we're shifting a little bit to quality documentation. Study documentation, code books, user guides, and technical documentation are some of the types of documentation that can be associated with a data collection. Given that journals and books are limited in the amount of space available for distributing project information, NACJD can provide project details that cannot be published elsewhere. I'll spend some time describing the elements of each of these and what the requirements are when we get to talking about the logistics of depositing a bit later. Now I will mention briefly some important issues that should be addressed during the analysis phase when project staff are actively working with data files to investigate research questions. As analysis proceeds, there will be various changes, additions, and deletions to the data set. And despite the most rigorous data cleaning, additional errors will undoubtedly be discovered. The need to construct new variables might arise, and it's very important to establish and maintain good organization and structure for documents. One way to keep track of changes is to maintain explicit versions of the data set. So the first version of the data set might be from the original data collection process, and then the second version from the data cleaning that took place, and the third might contain the composite variable constructions and so forth. If you use explicit version numbers and they are reflected in the data set names, it becomes much easier to match the documentation to the data sets and to keep track of what was done by whom and when. And then also deciding about whether to store the data in raw ASCII plain text format or in a statistical package is also important. Generally, system files such as a STATA file or an SPSS.sav file takes up less space than raw ASCII data and permit the user to perform analytic tasks more readily. You'll also want to determine what the file structure that is most conducive to data analysis is for your project. So this can be flat or rectangular files, hierarchical files, relational databases, longitudinal or multi-wave study files, just depending on your project's needs. And then also getting into a regular backup cycle. So determining what files need to be backed up and with what frequency, and the considerations of the file naming conventions can assist in making sure that you're backing up the right files. Phase 5 and beyond of the data archiving lifecycle encompasses preparing the data and corresponding documentation for sharing, depositing data with us for archiving, and then post-archival activities. The important thing to note at this stage in the process is that NACJD staff are very happy at any point in the process to talk to you and provide information for your specific project to help you in preparation for submitting data for archiving. There's also a lot of helpful information on our website to assist you in preparations for archiving.